If you're listening to this podcast, you are clearly already an astute consumer of insight and analysis, and you know the value of staying up to date with the latest developments in the shipping industry. So I am delighted to tell you that Lloyd's List has launched a new mobile app, meaning that our award-winning journalism and expert analysis will be available at your fingertips wherever you are. Available on the App Store for iOS users and Google Play for Android devices, the app keeps you connected with the events in the maritime world through a personalized user experience and tailored alerts. And crucially, the app also provides a new home for this, the Lloyd's List podcast. So hit pause, and before you listen to this week's edition, download the Lloyd's List app immediately. The global climate circus heads to Baku, Azerbaijan this weekend for the start of the annual confab. That's the Conference of the Parties, meaning the signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP29 to you and me. Shipping will be there, but don't expect much in the way of headline conclusions this year. If there is going to be any progress from this meeting, it's going to focus on the new Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance, NCQG for the acronym aficionados out there. So, why are we talking about COP this week, I hear you ask? Well, I shall tell you. The reality is that COPs have never really been about shipping. I know, it's a shame, but that's the way it is. Nevertheless, what happens inside COP has a direct bearing on what happens next in terms of shipping's long-term regulatory future. This year specifically, COP is taking place just 6 months before the International Maritime Organization sits down to agree the economic and technical measures to hit the industry's 2050 net zero targets. What happens in COP has at least some bearing on what happens in the IMO, and perhaps more importantly, shipping's ability to make connections across the energy ministerials out in Azerbaijan over the next 2 weeks are going to be crucial to that process that follows whatever comes out of the IMO. Shipping may not be a huge part of COP, but COP matters hugely to shipping.
So there are a couple of aspects there are many aspects that I find really interesting to do with COP, and why we keep attending, even though it's obviously, you feel like you're joining a circus. The key negotiations between the government are not something that directly interacts with the shipping policy.
That's the leading shipping climate academic and podcast regular, Dr. Tristan Smith, Associate Professor in Energy and Transport at University College London.
The three areas that I'm particularly interested in are the energy transition aspects of it. It's where a lot of energy ministers go, it's where a lot of the energy industry go, it's where you get a sense as to where the wider investment into renewables, hydrogen and ammonia is heading. So it's interesting to see and get a sense of where the wider government policies are, national strategies and corporate activity around renewable energy, because obviously that's critical to the generation of the energy supply chains that shipping is going to need. So that's one area. Another area is to see how shipping is being considered or not and factored in. And I think historically, I started going to COPs in Paris at COP21, so in 2015, and there shipping was present, but it was a very small aspect of the negotiations. We've seen that really change, and so governments are now increasingly aware, I think, of shipping's decarbonisation, of its interaction with their wider energy transition. And so that's positive to see, but it's useful to keep a track on and to keep presence on, because obviously you don't want people to forget about shipping and the potential synergies that occur as a result of IMO policy. And then the other aspect is how finance, and in climate finance in particular, and equitable transition is evolving in the IMO space. One of the breakthroughs at COP28 was to do with the loss and damage fund, and so all of this produces architecture which is highly relevant to the IMO discussions on what contributing to a just and equitable transition might be. The way that IMO's greenhouse gas pricing might then be dispersed is affected by that wider architecture, and also by the wider conversation on climate finance. We saw last year at the Macron summit, before the summer and before the adoption at the IMO of its revised strategy, a move by governments to try and look for innovative sources of finance, of which shipping was mentioned, and of which activity continues to build towards COP30 in Brazil. And so that work stream is relevant to the IMO negotiations. So there are lots of overlaps and reasons to keep an eye on what is happening in COP.
Now, for those of you in the weeds of this, you might want to tune out for a minute here because I'm not going to be telling you anything that you don't already know. But I think for a lot of people, the COP process is somewhat impenetrable. So it's worth noting exactly what is happening inside these COPs before we get into why all that matters directly to shipping. When the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, it was agreed that countries would regularly return with more ambitious plans to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and tackle global warming. The opening plenary is generally about world leaders on stage talking about what their countries intended to do about climate change or the dire consequences they face as a result of it, depending on whether they are rich or poor countries. That's the public bit. But inevitably, much of the action occurs offstage. Once the heads of state leave, members of each country's delegation begin negotiating, drafting papers, and setting out their positions on various issues. That's where the NCQG comes in, by the way. The new Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance. Trips off the tongue, doesn't it? But it's going to be vital in mobilizing the finance to accelerate climate action in developing countries, replacing the previous targets of $100 billion per year by 2020, which countries were late to meet and didn't meet in the first place. So, back to the COP structure, because we still haven't got to the part where shipping gets involved, but it's coming, because all that relates to the state-level drafting of negotiated outcomes, and shipping is generally in the category of observers who operate on the sidelines. But, and this is the important bit, it is the best possible opportunity for shipping to connect industrial policy with energy ministers and to join the dots with the wider energy transition. This year, the connection between conversations within IMO and conversations within COP about what is referred to as the just and equitable transition is crucial, because this is essentially about where the money goes from any shipping levy. It's also about making sure that policy creates the right demand signals and ultimately spurs the supply of zero-carbon molecules available to shipping. Now, this is a much bigger conversation than just shipping, and COP is a crucial platform to have that discussion. Here's Catherine Palmer, the maritime lead at the Climate Champions team, who are effectively charged with driving real-world momentum into the UN climate change negotiations.
Shipping as a significant demand sector for green hydrogen-derived fuels is much more prominent. And if we, I spend a lot of time talking to the supply side, and we have, like I said, a good coalition and community of supply and demand actors coming together to have conversations and understanding of what is needed to get hydrogen projects to FID. Everyone talks about offtake agreements and what are the barriers to those and what do we need to do. And like you said, what are the demand policies that need to be put in place to create these new markets? And, that is a big part of COP29 this year, because at COP28 we saw the launch of the ITA, the Industrial Transition Accelerator, by the UAE presidency. Maritime is a sector within that, and a lot of that work that's being delivered this year is about demand policies. And I think that's where we are now in the shipping policy space, is very much, we're writing regulatory text. And what is it in that regulation that gives that investment certainty to, both supply and demand actors, that they can invest and to make business decisions. So that's why I think this is really, it's a critical moment in the maritime sector's transition, and the timeline that we have with the IMO, and I think this is kind of another key political moment where you've got maritime actors able to bring that message to policymakers who are not necessarily the policymakers in the IMO room, but they're in with the same, across ministry governments, whether it's with the energy, whether it's with the finance, whether it's with the climate, so it's not just about talking to the transport or the foreign affairs who have responsibility at the IMO. It's about sort of crossing those different departments within governments, and And so I think, the opportunity that the maritime sector has at COP to be able to say, we are a significant demand sector. Yes, we're ready to move. And we probably are one of the most advanced sectors. If we look at it from what is happening in other sectors, shipping is probably the most advanced and has this real opportunity to be able to show leadership in tackling some of these difficult conversations and difficult decisions that only other sectors are going to have to follow, when they catch up to the place of where we are as a sector. So I think, getting this message across in this forum is really important, because it's still a political moment between now and the April MEPC meeting of where decisions need to be made. So it's another opportunity. And shipping is seen much more in the context of the wider energy transition. And also not just the energy transition, but the fact that we are coupling energy and equitable transition, and we're able to show, which is a very difficult conversation, and difficult decisions have to be made to be able to do the two together in parallel. And I think, we can bring in more diverse voices by having these conversations at COP that we might necessarily not have when we're doing them in the IMO. So I think there's an opportunity to be able to advance some of the understanding, advance the dialogues, and then build trust amongst different parties. So there's real opportunities to take by having these conversations in the UNFCCC process as well.
Okay, so back to that link between the COP discussions and the IMO decisions that we're all waiting for. Just because energy ministers are discussing green fuels for green transition projects in Azerbaijan doesn't necessarily flow directly into the IMO discussions, but it does inform it. COP is not exactly a litmus test of progress within the IMO, but it is strongly linked.
What I think you get from the COP is actually credibility and feasibility, which can be leveraged by the IMO. And one particular area of that is this subject of revenue distribution. So the IMO only just managed a conversation, probably a couple of hours, on the subject of revenue distribution at MEPC 82. It was not a conversation it was able to have at the previous meeting, MEPC 81. And so it now has very belatedly, over the next 6 months, got to very rapidly turn a nascent conversation into detail that can be put into MARPOL or in guidelines or whatever. What I think creates the information that is important to that IMO debate is what you get out of what is GCF doing, what is the UN's other funds like loss and damage, what is GEF, the Global Environment Facility, doing, what can we listen to at COP that shows what projects are already being funded in developing countries to do with energy supply side, to do with addressing adaptation needs in countries, to do with mitigating economic impacts in countries, because all of that detail then provides the case studies that can give some more concrete description of what IMO's revenue distribution could look like. And so at this point in time where we've got an incredibly compressed period over which to come to some detail and come to some decisions, I think that's going to be very helpful. And that was a direct call actually from the working group at IMO. So the MEPC 82, one of the outcomes was to request organizations such as World Bank and GCF and all of these institutions that have the knowledge, they're the global experts on how do you do revenue distribution. It was a request from them to provide information to the IMO's process, because the IMO process recognises it needs this fund and revenue distribution problem solved. So I think there's a lot that we get from that, but it's not a litmus test.
I should point out here that COP is not an entirely nebulous fortnight of top-level chat. There are shipping specifics at COP that we should all be keeping an eye on.
The first one is a Green Fuels for Green Shipping call to action. And so that really sets out commitments from different actors across the maritime value chain around building a nascent green hydrogen economy, and using green hydrogen derived fuels in the maritime sector, but then also calls on policymakers for what is needed in the demand policy enabling environment to make sure that we do land regulations and policy in the maritime sector that enables investability, but also couples the energy transition with an equitable transition. We've also got on the resilience side of things, so it's not all about mitigation. I think that's another important thing to remember, that obviously we focus probably 90% of our time in the maritime sector on mitigation efforts. And obviously in the UNFCCC space, we have adaptation and resilience as well as mitigation. So if we look at, if we're going to have to put in new infrastructure for the energy transition, how resilient is that infrastructure to climate change? And so why not, let's look at it at the same time rather than, and so we've got some leading examples where ports, when they've done expansions for new infrastructure, they've undertaken climate risk assessments and then understood how they need to adapt the infrastructure or the design to accommodate for changing sea levels, for more frequent storms, for the risks that they would experience depending where they are.
There is also a pretty extensive list of other programs, not least the biodiversity agenda and its links to shipping and the regionalization programs that will focus specifically this year on Africa and unlocking the financial flows into greening Africa's fleet and Africa's maritime industry. Now, that's a topic that I want to spend a bit more time on soon, specifically in relation to Namibia, but we'll come back to that in a future episode. Anyway, back to what all this means for shipping now. And as you might have clocked, a lot of the COP chat is pretty nebulous stuff. But I stand by my original point that all this matters to shipping, and it matters because of timelines. The IMO has been clear that it is set to agree something in April next year. But if you listen to the language being used, it seems that a lot of the detail is probably not going to emerge until October at the very earliest. So this idea that we are somehow all waiting for a big bang in April next year that will allow us to suddenly move ahead, that may not be the reality. But does this and should this hold things up?
Sorry, this is going to be unsurprising me, but I've been saying we've known everything we needed to know since 2015, arguably, right? And so the MEPC 82 outcome of a revised strategy with targets that are approaching what the IPCC advises is not surprising and is something that should be guiding investment decisions now. And those who choose not to be guided by the basic IMO greenhouse gas targets are basically betting on the IMO failing to regulate, failing to come up with policy which is in line with what they've expressed they will do in the revised strategy. So whether or not you get that clarity from the approval or the adoption of a measure is irrelevant, really. It's whether or not you think that those measures will ultimately be enforced and that the IMO will stand behind its strategy as it's already adopted and has hardened since it adopted its initial strategy. So I don't think that there's any merit. All you're doing if you're playing around this is going, well, maybe I've got one more year and I'll just go for some LNG for a year or something. We're not talking about something that is material to the real asset values here, except for someone who's playing a very short-term game.
And so finally, bringing things back to the IMO discussions between now and April next year, all the questions that we are asking at COP about a just and equitable transition, energy supply chains, and where these green molecules are going to be coming from, that all starts to matter in terms of the detail of the decisions we need to make in shipping. The detail of what gets agreed at the IMO matters.
I think there is still substantive work to be done because we have quite a broad spectrum between a position which is around only using a flexibility mechanism to drive energy transition and using flexibility in combination with a greenhouse gas fund or rather in combination with a greenhouse gas price. The thing that I think reduces the spread from an investor's perspective is that we heard quite clear detail about how the flexibility mechanism could be used with a multiplier in order to enable investment in early adoption of long-run solutions. So, if you like, e-fuels. So there isn't necessarily a difference in the strength of business case that you get from those two mechanisms. But there is a question about the equitability of the investment case or the equitability of the policy that we get out, because a a flexibility mechanism driven energy transition is an equity agnostic transition. It just says, here's a reward for whoever is able to make the early adoption business case. Whereas if you have a revenue solution, some of that might be equity agnostic. It might be just a subsidy on the fuel, but some of it might be more targeted at countries in specific circumstances. And so it's really a question of the geography of the energy transition as opposed to whether you get the energy transition. And I think that's the key remainder. So that's still going to be important to a lot of people making decisions, at least on the energy supply chain. It's less important to the people investing in ships, because whether or not your ammonia comes from Namibia and Mauritania or Australia and North America, it's still ammonia.
Okay, that's where we leave it this week. We are now in the weeds of policy discussion that I appreciate are not for everyone. But the closer we get to a tangible outcome of these discussions at COP and at the IMO, the more important it is that we understand what is happening and why. My thanks to both Tristan and Catherine for lending me their expertise this week, and best of luck to everybody who's heading out to Baku. Please come back with something solid to share with us. And a reminder, if you haven't already, please ensure that you download the new Lloyd's List app. It really is very good, and it'll improve your life immeasurably. So go and check it out right now, and I will be back with you next week. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.